All right. So psyched to be here with Arthi, my old pal, and also Helen, who I'm meeting for the first time. Helen Cupp, who is co founder of Slack's Future Forum and the co author of a book that just came out or is about to come out, depending on
Just
when you
came
watch
out. Just
this,
came out.
just came out, called How the Future Works. And as you know, Helen, today we're talking about this resistance that Arthi and I both feel coming from different sides of the marketing and PR industry to remote work and figuring out what work is going to look like in the future. So, of course, we thought of you for this topic. And I'd love to just hear a little bit more about how you came to this line of work and what you're seeing out there.
In many ways, I am still so surprised that you're seeing resistance, and also not surprised that you're seeing resistance in adopting flexible work. Especially as I think about executives that we've spoken to, it's clear that preferences have shifted with people and employees in all industries all around the world. And it's clear that we can make it work, right? We've debunked a lot of the misconceptions about what can be done in the office, what needs to be done in the office versus can be done remotely. And yet in many ways, I'm not surprised, because I do think that there's still a lot of uncertainty around flexible work. And I think that uncertainty is driving a bit of this resistance and eagerness to return back to a world that was a lot more familiar, a bit more of that nostalgia. So I wanted to say that before we got started. But I came into this work. Honestly, I feel like I've been thinking about this work even before we launched Future Forum. I got pregnant with my first baby in 2019. And I still remember all of the unsolicited advice that I was getting from parents and non-parents who were kind of like, things like, expect to slow down your career for the next 5 years. Work-life balance is a myth. Not helpful, but also I think in my gut, I felt like there needed to be a better answer for that, right? It couldn't just be that we needed to slow down, or that we, couldn't find a way where there was some balance to how we were thinking about work and the office and office culture in general. And fortunately, as I was coming back from mat leave, the world also got hit with a pandemic. That's sort of my silver lining. And all of those assumptions that we had about the office got thrown out the window overnight when everyone was forced to do things differently, not because we wanted to, but because we had to. And it gave me and my co-founders a great opportunity to take a step back and just ask, well, what is working, right? And how is employee preference shifting due to the environment that we're in? And what are some of those bright spots? Like, what are we benefiting from? Where are some of those wins and silver linings? And the more and more we dug into that, the more we were finding that actually there were so many more benefits than we even realized when we first started, and that people were really opening up their eyes to there can be better for me, for my team. And 2.5 years later, you can see that people are looking for a path forward, not a path back to what was. And so that's why we wrote the book. It's more of a how-to for making flexible work, pulling in a lot of the data and insights that we've collected over the last 2.5 years on Future Forum.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. And I want to touch on two things. Like, one was the resistance piece, because I wanted to clarify what I'm seeing as far as resistance. In 2020, the resistance was, most of the agency leaders, and I'm speaking from a PR agency perspective, many of the agency leaders I spoke to in 2020 were just like, oh, well, Memorial Day will come and we'll be back in the office, or, and then when that was clear that wasn't going to happen, it was like, well, Labor Day, we'll be back in the office. And by the time we came around to 2021, even with the vaccines, there was some acknowledgement for most of the agencies I spoke to that we would never go back to a 5-day work week. Now, fast forward to 2022, I think that, 5-day work week in office. The embrace of hybrid seems to be near universal. I don't see a ton of resistance to that, including from some of the leaders that were very set on coming back full time in 2020. What I would like to question as part of this conversation is the viability of hybrid, like sort of better defining what that actually means. Does it just mean that people come into the office on these set days? Or is there some more intentionality behind it? And where do you see, how does it really succeed? Because it seems like from some of I think the Atlantic just did a piece, and we've seen some other pieces about how hybrid's not really working. It's just sort of making people more frustrated and confused as to like why they're having to schlep back in. So I'd love to sort of talk about that, and at this point that I do think that there are a lot of people in our industry that are going kicking and screaming into even a hybrid world. If it were up to them, to your point, Helen, they do want the familiarity of a 9-to-5 work week that they that they sort of grew up with and that they learned to manage within. So I really want to ask this question around. So you don't want to embrace hybrid fully. You don't want to do the work to make it work, or you want to use, for instance, a recession as an opportunity to force people back into the office, as we've seen a lot of business leaders sort of hint at. What's the cost? Like, let's really ask that question. Like, what's the short-term, medium-term, and long-term cost to your business around that? And one last thing I'll say is, Helen, I also worked remote. I've worked remote since 2007, with the exception of 1 or 2 years in an office. And I have had 3 different jobs that I've worked, and 4th, if you include what I'm currently doing, have all been remote. And the resistance prior to the pandemic that I would hear from people, and every single myth you could imagine, from, oh, I don't know how anyone gets anything done, or how do you manage people, or how do you have teamwork and collaboration? And it was so frustrating to me having to prove to people that I could do all of those things remote. And I love that we are, and now there's more of a collective understanding around those things, but those myths still exist. So I'd like to address those as well. So anyway, Leslie, sorry, anything you want to say before we sort of really dive into this conversation?
No, I really want to hear from Helen. I want to hear about what preferences people are showing, like you mentioned. Let's talk about that data, and talk about what companies risk by not trying to give their employees what they're asking for.
So maybe we can start this with, Helen, do you want to just sort of talk about the data that you've seen? And then I would love to sort of go a little bit deeper into defining hybrid and what companies need to think about in order for that to be successful.
Yeah, there are so many good things that you brought up, Arthi. It's like we can have a full hour conversation about just all of that. But I will start with, there isn't an executive that we talk to that doesn't believe that their competitive advantage and differentiator is going to be their people, that it is their people, right? And the important thing is that, like I mentioned, people's preferences have shifted in terms of what they want, what they expect from companies. And so what we're seeing across the board is flexibility is now table stakes. It's only second to compensation in terms of what people are looking for from their jobs. And those who don't get the flexibility that they want, we're seeing 71% of them be willing to look for a new job in the next year. And you might say, okay, near term, if there's a recession, we're worried about jobs, maybe we can force people back into the office. Maybe, right? You can argue that. But when you look at the long term and what you're building for and how do you attract the best people and the most talented people are always going to have choice. And if you're thinking short term, we can take advantage of that now in the recession, think about how that's going to impact how people view you as a leader, as a company, the, what you offer them in terms of work environment when you're thinking about long-term pipeline and the people that you are continuing to bring, past the recession, because we will get out of a recession eventually. This is very natural in the business cycle. And you want to be building for the long term, not just aiming at the short term.
So it sounds like that resistance is coming from this short-termism. Leaders who are focused on what feels good today, what's going to help me today, and not thinking about how to invest in the medium and long-term success of their business.
I think there's also just a disconnect between executives and employees, right? You think about most executives, built their career around a type of way of working. The office culture really worked for them, and they were trained to lead and manage by walking the halls. And so in many ways, there's a bit of nostalgia associated with that experience, and just a comfort with, this is how I did it, this is how I manage, and this is the only way that works. And I think what we're seeing is an opportunity to say, that might have worked for certain types of people, certain demographics in particular, but there's an opportunity to think about, how can we make growth and opportunity and work more inclusive and just work for more people. So I'll pause there.
So can I ask, so two things that I wanted to bring up. One is building on what you're saying about this disconnect between management and employees. And part of that is just even defining what flexible means, right? And yeah. I mean, I remember in the pre-pandemic days, it was not uncommon for flexible to be defined by management as, oh, well, don't worry, we don't have our first meeting until 9:30 so that parents can drop their kids off at school in the morning. But if you spoke to employees, that was not sufficient, especially for instance, like a working parent, like just being able to have a little bit of breathing room so that they could do drop off was not enough. So I wanted to expand a little bit on that disconnect and why that persists, A, and B, like what could, what's a forcing function for managers to listen to employees? Because I've also seen in our industry, managers have taken surveys from their employees and discarded the results and said everything from "this doesn't work for me" to "I don't think the employees totally know what they want. This won't work for our business." So, how can, what is there a way that you've seen that works to do that? And also really just kind of defining what flexible means, and if you all did that as part of your research.
Yeah, I'll start there. I think when we talk about flexibility and hybrid work, we hear a lot, especially in the media, right, about how many days in the office, how many days at home. It's really about the conversation is anchored around flexible location. And yes, flexible location is important. We're seeing, 79% of people want some flexibility in where they work, but almost everyone, 94%, want flexibility in when they work. So schedule flexibility. And that speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Arthi, about, someone like a parent or really anyone who wants a bit more autonomy around their day and how they use their time, right? Like, I don't want to have to send a message to my entire team letting them know that I'll be out for 1 hour for a doctor's appointment. That seems really silly. If I'm getting my work done, you shouldn't care that I have to step out for an hour. Or even if I want to take an afternoon walk with my dog to, get some fresh air, to move around a little bit, I shouldn't have to get permission, right? And I think that leads to that second point that you talked about. As executives, we have hired the best people. We aim to hire the best people. And I think what I continue to ask executives is, like, if you're hiring the best people, why wouldn't you trust them to do the work that you set out for them? Like, you've set outcomes for them, trust them to manage their schedule, their time in a way that will meet those outcomes. And I think that's underpinning a lot of these discussions around flexible work. There's how will I know that they're working if I don't see them in the office? And we worked with the CHRO from Royal Bank of Canada, Helena Gottschling, and she used to ask her managers, to flip to kind of push on their assumptions. Well, how did you know that they were working when they were in the office? Like, it's not like you were sitting next to their computer watching their every movement. Why is it that out of sight, we suddenly feel like we need to control even more? Is sort of that, big question.
Can I ask if either of you know this? Because I've seen early on in the pandemic that there was a lot of surveillance software. Everything from recording keystrokes to taking. One of the most invasive ones was periodically taking photos of people in front of their desks. Have either of you? Have either of you seen this? Like Helen, was this? I don't know if you looked into surveillance data as part of your survey, or Leslie, have either of you seen any like this implemented? I know for the PR agency side, I know from what I understand, some agency owners were asking about this. I don't think any actually implemented it. I think they got enough resistance. So I'm just curious if that's factored in at all. Just to that point about.
I mean, in my world, I work with startups, and so they're on the list of technology that they're willing to invest in to make their next business milestone. Like, surveillance is just not a part of the culture, not a worthwhile investment.
Mm-hmm.
But Helen probably has access to larger companies. She can tell us what it looks like on the inside.
Yeah, I think that we've heard companies look into monitoring and surveillance software, but I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking, what kind of culture, what kind of value are you signaling when you do that? And how will employees feel in terms of whether or not they feel trusted, right, to do the work? We were having this conversation once with an executive or a senior leader in a company that mandated return to office at least a couple days in the office. And they would check that you were swiping in so that you were actually coming into the office. And when you do that, and when you don't trust your people, and you create these mandates that don't have a lot of purpose, you see employees gaming the system and doing weird things that actually are counterproductive. So the senior leader would commute into the office and swipe in, stay there for an hour, and then leave. And that was such a waste of time. But because it was surveilled, because that was a requirement, this person felt like, this was the best way to balance what he needed from work, but also meet, check the box and meet the requirements. And that's not what we're trying to do, right? We want our employees to be productive. We want to give them the freedom to figure out what's going to work for them. And honestly, a lot of the surveilling and monitoring, I think what we'll continue to find is that people will game the system in ways that are extremely counterproductive.
Yeah, it's so interesting to keep coming back to this is really like a relationship issue about addressing fear. Psychological safety is something that we talked about in our last call, and you said that psychological safety is the top predictor of a creative and productive environment. And so I'm curious, when we started this chat, you said, there's some surprising benefits to companies that are getting this right. Like, when you do create that psychological safety and you give employees the flexibility that they're asking for, and you see that in the data, what are some of those surprising positive results that people can look forward to?
Yeah, I think one of the most surprising things that we found is, we hear a lot about how you need the office to build connection, sense of belonging. People need to see each other. And we saw actually that when people went fully virtual over the last 2.5 years, sense of belonging actually increased for people that were traditionally underrepresented in office work. So people of color and women, caregivers in particular. And that's an indicator that mythology about you needed to be in person to build connection, that was the best place for everyone, really got debunked when we looked at that data.
Can I so I'm really curious about this because as we saw in 2020, DE&I was front and center for the whole business community, right? And especially companies that have, traditionally not excelled in that area. And for instance, PR agencies, while they have, while the workforce is 70% women, 70 to 85% women, depending on who you ask. People of color are hugely underrepresented. And it felt like when we started having these back to office conversations that they were almost happening in vacuums, that people were not connecting the dots between their diversity goals and their, and these back to office plans. And in fact, if anything, I remember hearing some people saying that they were worried that remote work would actually be harmful to women and people of color. And I don't know if that was because of proximity bias, that they already, they're already not top of mind for promotions and for fast tracking, that now if they're not visible in the office, that will, intensify that effect. So Helen, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of integrating these two concepts together, or these two goals together.
Yeah. Such a double-edged sword, right? I think when we looked at the data, we did find that going fully virtual had a lot of benefits around improving sense of belonging, which is why it wasn't surprising when we looked at, for example, we looked at people of color in the US, and we saw that like Black employees, for example, 81% of them wanted hybrid or fully remote, compared to just 77% of white employees. And that's partly because in many ways, like you felt it, I felt it, when you're a tile on Zoom and everyone sort of has, a tile on Zoom, it feels like there's more opportunity for you to have a voice in the room, right? If you're introverted like I am, you can use the chat, you can use the raise hand features. There's a lot more in that virtual version that enables more people to speak up and be included in conversations and in meetings and decisions that maybe the office or the in-person meeting wasn't a great environment for. But I say double-edged sword because yes, traditionally underrepresented people want more flexibility. And what that means is if we are not intentional about hybrid, we might create a wider gap if we let proximity bias happen. So there's going to be certain groups that want to go back to the office. And if our executives are also going back to the office, you can see a world where the opportunities are available to those who are closest to our executives, which is what it has naturally been in the pre-pandemic times as well. And so we have to be very thoughtful about how to make hybrid so that we're not widening this gap.
Yeah, how do you do that as a leader? How do you proceed with intentionality when you think about how to design the in-person experience, how to design the virtual experience and bridge the two? I think people are grasping at straws a lot of the time.
Yeah, it starts with leading from the top and leading by example. I talk about that experience of if you have your executives who come into the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, it doesn't matter if you have flexible policies. What you're signaling with your action is you also need to be in the office if you want to get FaceTime with the boss. And if you can't, too bad. And so you have to lead by example. And in many ways, I've seen companies do this intentionally by, hiring an executive team that is not from the same location. So they're more distributed across location and time, so different time zones as well. There's this concept of guardrails and leadership speed limits that we use, where we say, executives, like, you cannot come into the office actually more than X number of days in a week or X number of days in a month. And partly that's because you set the tone with that behavior, right? You set the tone around what is actually our flexible policies, not the ones that we say, but the ones we do. And so that is an important step in continuing to level that playing field.
So there's a real responsibility for leaders not to just create policies, but to lead with their own behavior and to make choices to signal to the rest of the organization that this is real. I think, that's something that I think leaders struggle with, because you get to a leadership position of, whatever degree, and you think, great, now I can make everybody do it my way, or I'm going to create an environment that works for me, and I'm going to attract other people who are like me, right? And that's who I want, right? That's how I, quote, create my culture. So I think for some leaders, it could be a little bit like, okay, check yourself. Like, being a leader doesn't mean you always do the things that you want.
And just building on that, Leslie, like going back to the start of this conversation, it also assumes that the leaders want remote work to work, right? If they don't want it to work, having the executive teams go in, sort of encouraging in-office interactions in whatever subtle or overt way is a way to pressure people and for people to go back to the way it was, where if you were remote and if that was necessary for you for whatever reason, you'd had to resign yourself to the fact that you wouldn't be in top consideration for certain plum jobs. And I think that's the real concern here. In in the PR industry, it's known for, I think it's gotten much better, but there was a point where our industry was, 70, well, let's say 85% female. But if you looked at the top CEOs at all of the top agencies, women were less than 30% represented in those corner level positions. And what I'm concerned about is, while we are, making this rush to embrace remote work, is there a little wink, wink, but if you really want that top, if you want the corner office, you really need to be showing up every day. And I don't know, as of right now, I think everyone outwardly is still saying that remote work, hybrid work is great. It's the future. But, once we start seeing, when it comes time for promotions, I think old habits die hard, right?
Yeah, it's why on Future Forum, we focus so much on addressing this executive leadership crowd, right? Because so much of it hinges on ensuring that they are aware of these blind spots, aware of these, inherent biases that occur, and how to develop systems and programs that help, overcome some of those biases. So things like, hiring your executive team in a more distributed way is a step towards that. Leadership speed limits around behaviors is another one that's a little bit softer. But it's also thinking about ways in which you do promotion, how do you track that data, and how do you make opportunity available to everyone? Opportunity, information, and access to people are sort of the three big ones that I talk about a lot. And in the traditional, office environment, that often happened in the hallways, in informal conversations with these sort of relationships that form. And that's how we get the like old boys club, right? This is how we did it. It's informal. There's no system around it. And so you either get it or you don't. And with flexible work and being more intentional about just designing and writing down even what are new ways in which we work together, we can take a step back and think about, are we providing access and opportunity to everyone? And how do we do that? Can we surface, new step up projects in a way that, everyone can sign up for or raise their hand for, rather than just that hallway conversation that someone might have been able to have that if a great example is, if you're a working mom and you have to leave at 4 p.m. to go pick up your kid, you might have missed that happy hour where someone was talking about, oh, this cool next thing that's coming down the pipe. That excludes certain people that have responsibilities outside of just being at work 24/7. And so how can we be more thoughtful about those types of opportunities when we design a more intentional work environment?
Yeah, we've talked a bit about PR agencies and their challenges. Coming from startup land, it's actually quite common for teams to be distributed and in some cases fully remote. The company that I have been working for over the past 18 plus months hit its biggest growth spurt as a company during the pandemic. Went from 20 people to, at last count, 70 people, offering positions fully remote. And I think that's not uncommon. And it's also a way to find the best talent as well in what was a very highly competitive talent market, especially for early stage companies. But I think what the common ground is this topic of the intentionality that is required to create the culture and the business that you want. Just as you can't assume that all this is going to happen in person in the hallways, you can't assume that you open up the Slack channels and it just magically happens in Slack. There are actually some very specific practices and processes and rituals that companies can introduce in order to solve for a lot of what we're talking about. I have a few that I love, and I know we talked about the operating manual. That was really a game changer for me and my team as we were growing quickly, but can you talk about that, or maybe some of these other specific rituals that you've seen that really help?
Yeah, I'll first say that related to that point, a lot of the times what we hear from executives is, we need to open up the office and have people come back in because we'll lose culture otherwise. And that's in many ways, that's sort of a lazy perspective, right? To say, oh, culture is the writing on the walls, the values that we put, in writing.
How we named our conference rooms.
Yeah, how we name our conference rooms, what like food or happy hour or games that we have. And the companies with the best culture, even pre-pandemic, are the ones who were intentional about what are the rituals that we're building and how does that tie into our values, right? And so many of these things that we talk about for flexible work and being intentional are great practices for organizations and teams, even before. It's just saying, you need to do it now, especially now when there's a lot less structure overall around work. And so I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about that because culture comes up so often as a reason for the office. And I would argue that culture is more about the values and the rituals and how you connect as teams. And so that does lead to that tool. I love the personal operating manual, personal user manual, however you want to call it. Because so often, if you think about what actually happens in the office when people say like, oh, I want to go in and be face-to-face and connect with someone. My experiences tended to be, I get into work, I'm walking down the hallway, someone just says like, hey, how's your day? And I'm like, oh, it's fine. And then you walk away, right? Like very superficial conversations most of the time. And what is really beautiful about having a personal operating manual is it lays out, things like, what's my communication style? What do I do under stress? What am I working on? And when you have access to that and you can read through it and have, follow on questions about it with your team, with a colleague, you get to a much deeper place about how can we work together better? How can I best support you? And that in my mind is how you build strong relationships, right? It's getting to know each other and how to support each other in a much more meaningful and deep and intentional way, not the, every morning flyby conversation at coffee of like, how was your weekend? How was your day? Yes, those are important, but those manuals help, really drive deeper discussion. And I found those very valuable.
What I love about that as well is I think the default culture for our industry for a long time was over indexed towards extroverts. It was very much about alcohol and happy hours in the evenings as a way to connect, or even just those superficial conversations that you're referencing. And as our industry has grown up and diversified in terms of the profile of talent that's attracted to it, introverts may not connect with people in that same way. And I don't even know that introvert and extrovert is a binary thing, right? I think there's like a spectrum, and a lot of people are somewhere in that middle, where sometimes a happy hour is great, other times they want to have a deep dive coffee with somebody, or do a one-on-one, and that's really where they're going to come up with better brainstorming ideas, or solo on a walk, whatever it might be. But I think that that's a really good point in having that operating manual, whether that's personal, so that each person can sort of decide what works for them and sort of structure their connections around that, or even just kind of the agency or the company thinking about that more widely. The other piece, and maybe that this is a good time to ask about this, culture is one piece that I think there's a lot of resistance against remote work. The other is junior people and training them. And so I want to address, whether or not, how to fit that in. And I just want to see this idea that, to your point, Helen, that so many managers want to manage and they want to bring up the next generation of the workforce the way that they were, without acknowledging how much has changed and the role that digital platforms are playing in people's ability to connect, collaborate, and even learn, whether that's IM, Slack, Zoom. I mean, we have Gen Zers who go on dates via Zoom, right? I mean, so the world has really changed from sort of an in-person first world. So I want to get your thoughts, Helen, on junior people and training.
Yeah, it's interesting that in the data, junior people, new grads in particular, who've been in the workforce less than 5 years, arguably want more flexibility than others. And so it's a myth that they're the ones who want to come back into the office. They want camaraderie, they want relationships, but that is not a one-to-one equates to coming back into the office every single day. They like that flexibility, and we forget oftentimes. We've been in this, we've been working for a while, all three of us. I remember reading a study about Gen Z and how more than half of them have a friend, like a close relationship and friend, that they've never met in person. And so their comfort around digital is way higher than for our generation. And so it is an opportunity for us to rethink, how do we onboard them, right? How do we actually get them into the flow of our team rituals and traditions? Because that again is more about the rituals that define the culture, not the office. And I would argue that being able to be more explicit about what those norms are benefits new grads in those ways, right? You can now say, like, this is how we do things. Here's an opportunity for you to also question it, push back, because we are able to iterate on the ways in which our team operates. And so, I remember coming into the workforce as, like you said, as an introvert. And there are so many invisible norms that exist in the workplace. And it's just, for some of us, it's really hard to learn that by osmosis, or to feel comfortable with small talk and move in that direction. And so what I like about intentional, design of work, being explicit about it, writing things down, is it just increases the range of, how people can get familiar with norms and expectations and styles. It fits a broader, range of working personalities and types and ways in which we learn. And I think that is better, right? We're not saying that, for example, we're not saying you have to go fully remote, you have to go fully in person, you have to do fully virtual. It's sort of, we're increasing the range of the types of formats and tools and things so that it works for more types of people.
Yeah. Something I think that is common misconception among leaders thinking whether they are trying to solve for this or one of many other business issues that you're facing is that it requires executives or founders to go off and huddle and come up with the perfect strategy and then release it to everyone and enforce it. And I think, particularly when we're talking about a topic like this that is a bit amorphous, undefined, diverse in nature because people are diverse and what they need is diverse, it really requires creating an open line of communication and dialogue with your team and asking. And I have seen a lot of hesitation of leaders of businesses of all sizes. They're afraid to ask, or they'll open up the question box, but it won't be anonymous because they're afraid of what might pop up anonymously. Or, they'll pause during the all hands and say, anybody have any questions? And wait, one beat, two beat. Oh, okay, no questions. Um, so can you talk about like what role employees should be playing in defining these practices?
It's a balance. I think I was talking to someone earlier today about this fear of mass customization. So what happens if everyone only does the thing that they want to do? How do you make sure that the business still runs? And it is, I will be fully honest and say hybrid is messy. It's hard, right? The intentionality that we're talking about, it requires work. But what I'm saying also is that the work is worth it. And it's a balance. It's how do you balance business outcomes with preferences that individuals have. And so employees absolutely have a responsibility to, collaborate in this conversation. Like what will work for me, but knowing that we have this goal that we're trying to achieve. I can't just say, I'm sorry, I'm a hermit. I want to step away from all communications with people in any sort of meeting. Like, I don't know that it's going to work on a team, in a team environment. You're going to have to come together and get feedback and, work and discuss and debate things. And so where's that balance, right? And so one of the things we talk about in the team level agreement is, how do you create a norm that allows for, live team time as well as more focus and autonomy time for the individual. So how do you break up the day to enable that? And I think a lot of what successful teams do is work through those, how do we work together and craft that balance. And it is a balance, right? As projects change, as new team members come on board, that might shift, and it requires going back to those team norms and saying, does this still work for us? And I think that's a really important part of it as well.
So I want to build on something that you said about hybrid being work, because it is to do that well. It's not just, oh, everyone needs to be in the office on these 3 days. So, the Atlantic, I think the article that I was referencing earlier, hybrid work is doomed was the headline. And as we saw recently, Yelp CEO called hybrid hell, and they doubled down on remote. They shut all their offices. So maybe for a minute, I want to just do a little future prediction here. Do you see a world, and Lizzie, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this as well. Do you see a world in which hybrid gives way to a remote first workforce just because of the complexities involved with hybrid? Are we looking at a future in which teams get together a couple of times a quarter, and that time is much more intentional? Just in the same way that there was a time where only Fridays was a day that people wore jeans, and now right, eventually, right, we gave into the path of least resistance, and I just wonder if that's where we're headed with hybrid. So
Leslie, what do you think?
Casual Fridays, right? What a joke that seems now.
right, and because
Wasn't that
people,
long ago.
but yeah, I remember when the morning shows they had the fashion shows on what's okay and not okay to wear on a casual Friday. And but I think it gave way to the path of least resistance, and ultimately employees didn't see any reason why if they could wear jeans on Friday, why they couldn't wear them on Thursday. So yeah, I mean, is hybrid work doomed? Is this the first step towards a really remote first workplace? And again, I want to emphasize that this isn't a binary. I'm not saying we'll never see each other again, but will it be much more intentional? And will this idea of, okay, Tuesday through Thursday, we go to the office, is that already antiquated?
I mean, my big philosophical answer is I think that if we zoom out, humans are grappling with our relationship to the technology that we've created and how to bridge the gap between our digital lives and our lives IRL, or in meat space, versus cyberspace. So this challenge is playing itself out in lots of different aspects of our lives, and work is one of them. And I would also say that if staying zoomed out, if you look at the role that work has played in our lives over the last 100 years, it's actually, even since like probably the 50s and 60s, it's encroached into more and more of our personal lives, not just because of technology, but because it's where we get our healthcare. It's where we socialize. It's where we eat lunch and dinner sometimes. And so like work has crept and crept and crept like a kudzu vine, and it's kind of like choking out um, other ways of living. And so I think my prediction is this is part of a reset about our relationship to work and what we want a company and an office to be in our lives. As someone who has worked remote over the last 2 years, since I moved from New York to LA during the pandemic, it's been really challenging for me. And I thought, as also an introvert, I thought I would just love it, period. But it is not without its challenges. But it has also forced me to use my own intentionality and think about, okay, I'm not in an office. How am I going to get some human interaction today? You know, I'm going to join a swim club, which I tried and didn't follow through on. I'm going to join my neighborhood council. You know, I got involved in local politics to figure out who's in my community. How can I interact more with my neighbors? I'm making choices like that to create a lot of the things that work just gave me. And, you know, I accepted, but never really evaluated, is this a good thing or not? And I think for all of us in the workforce, leaders, employee, you know, whoever, to examine this is very healthy. So I'm not answering your question, but I think if we believe that like diversity is an inextricable part of this conversation, and you know, I think it is, especially the way we've talked about it, the answer is more multiplicity, and not something that is highly prescriptive.
So just to build on that quickly, and Helen, I want to hear from you then, is this idea of unbundling our lives from work. And I've actually seen some momentum in that direction. I think Ashley Mayer actually did a really great a thread on this, I think it was last year, where, yeah, I mean, should we be getting all of those things, Leslie, that you mentioned from work, and what's the cost of that, right? I mean, you said you got involved in local politics. Like, that is huge, right? I mean, that means that we can be better citizens, and we can give to something outside of our employers, which I feel like for so long, our entire lives, because we relied on our workplace for everything, including social interactions after hours, that, I think some things like civic life has suffered. So I think I think that, again, that to me, that points to a better future in which we can give ourselves to things that aren't just our jobs. Helen, your thoughts?
Oh, wow. That just, that resonated so much with me personally, but also with a lot of people that we've spoken to about flexible work, this unbundling of work and life, and reevaluating the role that work plays in our lives is a pretty consistent theme. And I would argue that, we also have a lot of conversations about loss of weak ties, right? With more distributed and virtual work, you might get closer with your team, but you can't have those serendipitous conversations. Being part of a broader community, I think you're pulling in even more diverse weak ties and perspectives into your own thinking. Like I often refer back to, I used to be a scientist, and some of the best innovations come when you are not talking to people in your field, right? When you're talking to someone random, and somehow that connection across what you're doing and a completely different field, a completely different profession, lights a light bulb, and says, oh, why did I not think about this in the same way before? And so I think there's an opportunity for even more innovation when we build those connections outside of work. But to your original question, Arthi, I do think that it's going to be a lot more multifaceted, right? I do think that it is in some ways easier to be on either end of the spectrum, but we say one size doesn't fit all. It doesn't fit all for, an individual or a team or an organization. Your needs, both now and later, will be shifting. And the best thing you can do is iterate and experiment and continue to find what works best. And we've all wanted to build more agile teams. Like, this is the time to do it, to figure out how to move more fluidly when we think about work. And I will also add that, yes, right, I think that forcing us to be more intentional about when we spend time together, how we spend time together, we will find that the teams that do this well will have gatherings that are so much more high quality, right? People will want to be there because there's a purpose, there's a reason, and you will be able to cultivate connections in a very meaningful and different way than if you just sort of peanut butter spread it across, every day in the office, 9 to 5. There's just this like assumption that things happen without us having to do any work behind the scenes. I don't think that is better.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, was that just as without the intentionality around remote work, things can unravel quickly. People don't realize that without intentionality behind the office, the same thing can happen. They take for granted that, because everybody's here and we can see them, that the magic is, it's happening. But to the point that you both made, right? Like, a lot of those interactions are not meaningful unless time is set aside to do that. And I just want to at least I know we have to wrap, but like, just, there tends to be a nostalgia for the past, right? And just acknowledging that the 5-day work week, which I personally don't think people are very nostalgic, because I think most employees think about that and then they think about all the hours that they lost from doing the things that they love or being with the people that they love. But, this idea I've heard executives talk about, when I was growing up in my career, we would go down to the bar afterwards. It's like, that nostalgia is not, tends to be with rose-colored glasses, and tends to sometimes overlook some of the pain points that people experience going into the office. But I do think that, I don't know, I think that nostalgia tends to be with people who were, employees and not management a long time ago. Because I think for people that it's more recent, they think about all the time that was lost.
Yeah, but it's also just we can't forget that the last 2.5 years of more remote, more distributed, more flexible working, we were doing it in a pandemic. And so even for the average person, there's a bit of nostalgia for what they remembered the office to be. And really, it's that, like, what we're craving is connection and being around other people. And when you deprive individuals of that, especially in just like in the community, I can't go meet my neighbors. We think that we need that again in all aspects of our lives all the time. And there's this nostalgia for like what the office was, without remembering that in many ways it didn't work really well for that purpose, and it didn't work really well for other purposes that we sort of pushed onto the office, because we were never intentional about building that. And so, with flexible work, I think there's just so much more opportunity to unlock, potential within teams to actually take an opportunity to redesign how work gets done, where we don't have to rely on even basic things like, why does all work have to happen in meetings? Why? We all hate it. We all know that most meetings are not productive. And yet we're stuck in this loop of like, if I need to get work done, I must schedule a meeting. Like, now is the opportunity to throw that out the window and say, maybe we don't need a meeting for this. Maybe we can do this asynchronously. We can, brainwrite in a doc and save discussion for something meatier. Now is the time to break some of those really bad habits that we've developed, quite honestly.
Yes, yes. And I feel like there's so many topics that we seeded here that should be its own podcast. And one of those is this unbundling, right? And what's the payoff when you have employees that have unbundled their lives? In 2007, when I was in my 20s, when I was working from home, and I had the same dilemma. And I thought, well, who am I going to hang out with? And I formed really great relationships, not only with people from multi-generations, people in my community, people from different work environments, which continue today to, I think, be beneficial to what I do, versus having everyone, my peer group, be doing the same thing day in and day out, really talking to the same people, listening to the same sources of information. It really sort of broadened my perspective. And if this really is about innovation and creativity, then this is something that employers really need to think about. And you think about Apple's massive campus, or Google sort of providing, all of the necessities to their employees. What's lost there? And I feel like that is a conversation that that feels like that should be another podcast conversation. I know I have to jump off, but oh my gosh, Helen and Leslie, and I have so many things that I still have listed, like the theory of X and Y. I feel like that's another conversation theory topic that we haven't even touched on. So Helen, I don't know how open you are to doing this again, but but I feel like there's just tremendous insight that you could provide on some of these other things as well.
Oh, it's always just fun to talk to you about this topic. I think we always find a new lens, a new layer when we have this discussion. And you're right, there's so much to dig into in all of this, both just in terms of stories that we've heard, the tools and tactics, and so much more data, so much more data, sometimes too much.
When are you all doing, do you have another research? Do you have another project or survey that you're doing that you'll have even more data?
Yeah, so we launched the survey, the Future Forum Pulse, every quarter. And so it's both refreshed every quarter, but also we get to see trends over the last 2.5 years. And we recently worked with our founding partner, Boston Consulting Group, to dive into the topic around like deskless and frontline workers, which I think is also really big and top of mind for a lot of executives. And so more to come as we move beyond just the office-based worker, and dive more into deskless, frontline, dig into like new grads, career development, and onboarding. I think those are all really big next level questions about flexible work that we're trying to answer with data.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's great, because there was a lot of privilege in having this conversation the way we're having it. All right, guys, I have to jump off. I really, so all right, we'll be in touch soon. All right, talk to you soon. All right, bye everyone.
Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you. Bye.